Longboard's running two different types of trucks, so we have an extremely asymmetric setup. And the theory behind that is we can
have the front provide the turning characteristics and the rear provide the stability characteristics, right?
Right. So we've got a board that carves really hard in the front, but then has a nice stable rear end that you can drift out and have nice controlled drifts to keep your speed under control.
And then you have those are the Kegel wheels too?
Yeah. I've been really impressed with them. They're a runaway freight train of a wheel. They like going fast, they hold a really good edge, they're responsive, and they drift pretty good. The only problem is they're extremely temperature sensitive. So
and they only come in one durometer.
Exactly. So as soon as you get them above the temperature which they work at,
which we're right at the cusp of,
yeah, then they just fall apart. You start to lose a lot of the grip. But it makes for some really good drifting.
So with the riding you were just doing, you weren't, you know, fanning them out and laying out long slides with them.
No, I'm just trying to keep my speed down. But it's really interesting because this setup allows me to change direction extremely quickly because I'm running such high angles. And
so
I've got
almost kind of like slalom, but not.
Yeah, I like slalom, but I'd prefer to call it super G, which is like the next step up from slalom. So it is quick, very active turning, but I'm drifting and bleeding speed on every turn because the pavement's so steep.
Okay, so it's kind of like slalom, but not with the objective not being speed, but almost with the objective of being slow.
Yeah, trying to make really steep terrain not unbelievably fast, which requires a truck on the rear that you can really plant your foot on and pivot around so that you can throw out the rear end to drift, but you still need to be able to take it all the way to one edge of the pavement and then snap it over and then carve to the other side as quickly as possible. So this is definitely something that Longboard is doing better than most. So, one of my personal theories as to what contributes to a good setup that allows you to have responsive turns, but then drift and hook up and then transition into another turn, is a setup that has very rigid axle movement. So basically, a channel truck is good because the axle is trapped in the channel.
It's restricted to the single plane of motion.
Exactly. So it's not able to really start moving in other directions except the one that it's designed to travel in.
Yeah, it's really rigidly pointing in a single way.
You know, it's just like having bearing spacers in your wheels. The bearing spacers prevent the wheel from being able to vibrate and lose control. When the trucks are rigid, it keeps the axles lined up so that when you're carving, you're keeping the wheels going in the direction that you want, and then you can snap the board and make it not go in that direction and start to bleed off speed by tearing the urethane and then hook it back up because the axles aren't trying to go in directions that you're not expecting. That's why the other Planet trucks are particularly good for that, because it's a channel truck. And the Rojas are also a very good example of that because it uses a fixed...
The bolt pin, or the bolt pivot.
Yes, there's literally a bolt that goes through here with bearings on it, and it can only revolve around one dimension of that bolt. So that, I believe, is the foundation of a good board that's able to drift and hook up and hold really aggressive carbs with. So that's what I built up, and that's what we're running with. So with a setup like this, I'm really able to smear the rear end around to control my speed by bleeding and drifting the rear end to keep myself at the comfortable speed I need to for this really steep terrain.
Or I could just bomb it, you know. That's what everyone wants. They just want you to bomb everything, Riley.
Been there, done that. I challenge them to carve this kind of stuff up without putting a hand down. So what we have here is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. It's going to be a traditional kingpin setup, and this basically has the least amount of axle path control. The axles are so much more able to move in all different directions that it just so happens to turn because it's moving in one direction more than the others.
It's not a question of which direction what plane is acting upon. It's just the matter of, you know, what's the path of least resistance.
Exactly. But it makes for a great skateboard. It's just a lot more challenging to do the drifting on it because you don't have the leverage and the control over the wheels as you do with a setup like the Rojas or the OPs. But it's still a heck of a lot of fun.
Yeah. And part of the reason is you run probably softer bushings than most people because you're used to getting more deck tip out of it, right?
Exactly. In fact, that's probably one of the most challenging things with this setup is that it doesn't get the same amount of deck tip that I'm used to. So it'll turn more because the geometry is so much more responsive, but it doesn't tip as much, so I'm constantly on the edge of the board really trying to lay the thing over to bring it through. So yeah, it is a totally different wheel. There's some side set race formulas from Sector 9.
So are these more in their temperature range?
Yeah, I've just found that these particular wheels have a much wider temp range than the Kegels do, so you can get away with it.
They sound a lot happier, I think.
Yeah, and they're definitely at the smaller size, which helps keep you more over the wheel and giving you more of the advantage. But they're definitely getting towards the end of their lifespan.
We're their ideal lifespan.
Yeah. So it's just a little different. It would be very interesting to swap wheels and really compare apples to apples, but I'm looking more at just the truck and I'm riding the wheels that complement the trucks the most.
Yeah.
Certainly a different experience. When I'm fully engaged in the drift, I can feel the axles vibrating. You know, the wheels start chattering, and then I can start to feel the axles to chatter.
It's not often.
Not to say that it isn't possible and it isn't fun, because it is. It's a lot of fun. But
yeah, you ride this board more often than the other one.
yeah,
right?
Just because it's so much more playful. And I have to admit, even though there's a lot of slop in the truck, it makes the truck feel somewhat forgiving. I can do things and step on the board incorrectly, and yet because the axle will put itself in a place where it's going to be
comfortable, whatever path of least resistance it wants,
then it's going to just allow me to stand there and then panic until I can get myself
yeah
back. So it makes for a lot of fun, and it makes it so that you can really carve up terrain and run through nastier sections and have the board come out on top. Whereas with the more precise setup, it may be easier to break the wheels loose and hook them back up. It does detract from just the comfortable.
I mean, you've got to be having it lined up right.
You got to be spot on every time. There's a lot less forgiveness.